Hello chess friends and welcome to Chesslovers channel. This is my 17th suggestion of mine. I believe this is the most outstanding book about planning in chess. There are not so many books about planning, and this book really discusses this very important activity in chess. If you want to succeed in chess, you must evaluate the position correctly, and after the evaluation you must have a plan. And this book discusses in detail different ways of planning, and I will give you an overview of why this book is so special. It's written by Peter Romanovsky, and he was born in 1892 and died in 1964. He looked like this. This is a Russian biography about him, Peter Romanovsky. There is a book in English written by Sergei Chakhenko, and it looks like this. I can certainly recommend this book if you want to explore more deeply into his life. However, it can be good to know that he won the Soviet Championship in 1923 and he shared the victory in the Soviet Chess Championship 1927. He was an outstanding trainer, player, writer, and a popularizer of chess. His life was very dramatic because he experienced the Winter War when the Nazis had sieged Leningrad, the winter 1941 to 42. Unfortunately, his family were frozen to death, and it was very close that Romanovsky would have succumbed as well to starvation and coldness. But they managed to find him in the last minute, so to speak. So all such details you can read about in this biography about Peter Romanovsky. We will mainly focus on this book, which is called Chess Middlegame Planning. The preface has been written by the translator of the book, Jimmy Adams, and I think the preface is very insightfully written. For example, he has written like this: his Middlegame is one of the best books in the world's chess literature. It has served as a guide to many Soviet masters. By his day-to-day penetrating analysis of his own games and the games of others, in which he seeks out unnoticed possibilities, Romanovsky sets the youth an example of how to work on self-improvement. So, what is it you need to know about this book, and why do I think it's so outstanding? If we want to learn about planning in chess, of course, we have this book, Lasker's Chess Manual, where he has written about the history of planning, starting, for example, with Philidor, and he goes further on in the history. But we need a book about planning which is more detailed and which deepen the subject, and how we can use this knowledge in our own games. And we can distinguish between several ways of planning, but first we must define what does Romanovsky mean with planning. He means that planning is the same as strategy, and that tactics is separate operations. An example, an educative example can be, for example, 1 d4, knight f6, 2 knight f3, b6. So what is Black's plan? Black's plan is obviously to control the long light diagonal and focus on the e4 and to a certain extent on the d5 square. It's a light square strategy. So this is the plan as a whole. And a separate operation could be, for example, that the knight on f6 moves to e4, followed up by f5 to consolidate the control of the e4 square. So we must differentiate between planning and concrete moves. So if we call planning the overall strategy, we can call the tactics the concrete moves, the separate operation. And he also talks about planning in 3 different steps. And the first step is the abstract phase. It's then we try to find our object, the weakness or weaknesses in the opponent's position. For example, if we have a battery with a bishop on d3 and a queen on c2, and Black has castled kingside and has the king on g8, we are threatening the pawn on h7. I mean, we imagine there is no knight on f6. So Black has to decide, should he play h6 or g6? So this is the first phase of planning. We try to provoke a pawn weakness. Let's say Black plays h6. Then we come into the second phase, which is more concrete. It is also the most difficult part of planning, because now we must be much deeper than in the first phase or the third phase. And to make this example easy, according to keep it simple principle, we can imagine that after h6, White can come up with a concrete plan, like playing castling queenside, put a rook on g1, and then go for g4, g5 to exploit that Black has played h6. Or if Black, instead of h6, had played g6, we could have played for h4, h5. So this is the second phase, when our object is concrete. We know which weakness to focus on. The third phase in planning is the technical phase, because then we should exploit our advantage, maybe to win material, or maybe to win in a mating attack, or some other decisive advantage, maybe according to the principle of 2 weaknesses, etc. So you should know that there are 3 different stages in planning: the abstract phase, the concrete phase, and the technical phase. And remember that the second phase is the most difficult phase. He also distinguishes between different ways of planning. For example, he talks about dynamic planning, and he mentions players such as Chigorin, Lasker, Pillsbury, Alekhine as representatives of this idea. Another example might be Morphy contra Staunton, and then Morphy would be a representative of dynamics. So for Romanovsky, this is opposite to, for example, thinkers like Tarrasch or Nimzowitsch, whereas Nimzowitsch would think in such ways as waiting, preventing, restraining, blockading. A dynamic player would have more foresight and prepare for the forthcoming events in a more concrete way. And a very famous example is the game between Alekhine and Bogolyubov, played in Budapest 1921. This position arose in that game. I hope it's clear for you, the position. So as you can see, it's tension in the center here, and the pawns on d4 and e5 will soon evaporate from the board. And then white will have a kingside majority with pawns on e4 and f2, which would be able to move forward. And this is dynamic planning, because this game really showed how dangerous this plan is. And later on in his history, Botvinnik was fascinated of this plan, and he played it in 2 games against Smyslov in their World Championship match in 1954, the 12th and the 16th match game. So Romanovsky advises the student to compare how did Alekhine play according to this dynamic plan and how did Botvinnik do it against Smyslov. And in this way, you would learn how Alekhine, respectively Botvinnik, played this dynamic plan, and you can use it in your own games. And this is one part of the explanation why this book is so outstanding, because it not only discusses planning in depth, in different perspectives, in different stages, but it also discusses model games and what the student should focus on. So this is his great strength. He is a pedagogical writer. And in my opinion, this book is very much underestimated for unbelievable reasons. However, it has been translated in 2013 again, and then they have also the second part of his book, which is about combinations. But we will not go into that now. We will focus on planning. So far we have said that planning is about 3 different phases or stages, and it can also be about dynamic planning. Another aspect of planning is harmonic planning, and here he distinguished between harmonic planning essentially means that pieces can be harmonically placed, but if they are not connected to a plan, he calls it harmonic inactivity. So you should strive for harmonic activity. It means that your pieces are harmonically placed as well as connected to a plan in the position. And an instructive example could be, for example, when Reti plays his famous queen maneuver where he puts the queen on a1, and he plays the rook is on c2, and rook f will come to c1, maybe knight d2, knight f1, knight e3, etc. Then we have a very harmonic placement of white's pieces. And this position is connected to a plan, like we mentioned before. It's about controlling the e5 square. So the strategy is about controlling the e5 square, and a separate operation could be, for example, knight e5 to prevent black from playing e5. So we also have to distinguish between two different sets up with harmonious piece placement, whether the pieces are connected to a plan or not. And we also have to think about dynamic planning as opposite to, for example, the prophylactic play as investigated by Nimzowitsch, and also Tara's play, which was heavily influenced by Steinitz. Another part of this book is also connected to planning, especially regarding maneuvering, because when we are doing these separate operations connected to plans, connected to harmonious piece placements, we obviously have to maneuver. I mean, the move made by Reti, queen to a1 and rook f to c1, etc., is a maneuver. And a great player in maneuvering was Wilhelm Steinitz, and he was the first great player who understood this area in chess. In the World Championship game against Lasker, 1894, we can see that Steinitz understood flexible maneuvering. And a concrete example is, for example, that in one game against Lasker, 1894, I don't remember which game, but anyway, he moved the kingside knight. He maneuvered the kingside knight to g5, where it was aggressively placed and in an attacking position. But later on in that game, it maneuvered back to h3 and then to f2 to defend the weak pawn on d3. So on f2, it was more passively placed, solidly placed, but it mainly had a defensive function. So here we could see that the attacking knight became a defensive knight, and this kind of flexible maneuvering comes from Steinitz and has affected the Soviet chess school very much. I know that also Mihail Yishin has talked a lot about this in a video of his, I don't remember which one. Anyway, we can see that Romanovsky, as Jim Adams has written, has really influenced the Soviet players very much. And of course, this is an important book. He's also writing about other things, for example, the eternal knight, the two bishops. When he's talking about the two bishops, he mentions, for example, very insightfully that it's not about the two bishops, it's about one bishop, because often one of the bishops is a key bishop, the stronger one, focusing on a particular color. So, and he also mentions that the bishop pair is also important when the opponent has the bishop pair, and I have never seen such statements written in any other book. So this book is completely unique, and it gives you real insight what planning is and different ways of planning, harmonic planning, dynamic planning. So in my opinion, this book is absolutely essential when we are discussing planning. So if you can't get this edition, try to get the edition from 2013, published on Quality Chess. But this is the book I have worked with, and I have worked with it very extensively. Yeah, one loose paper is always a sign of working hard with a book. But here you can see what it contains. You can see the names of the chapters. So, very interesting and important topic indeed. You can also try to get this book. I think it's more easily available. Anyway, one of these two books, and you will obviously have a great advantage against players who don't have this book in the area of planning. And planning is something you do all the time because it's a necessary complement to the evaluation of the position. Obviously, you must also complement it with calculation and variation and a great feeling for combinations. I hope you have enjoyed this recommendation, and I will continue with my further recommendations later on. So I hope to see you then, and thank you very much for watching.